All right. Well, let's have a time looking at what God would have to say to us this morning. If you take your Bibles, open up to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. August 6, 1991, a historic day in the history of the world. August 6, 1991, some of you were here around that time. Anyone know what happened that day for the first time in human history? The world has never been the same since then. Seriously. Not a joke. On August 6, 1991 was the official first day of the public opening of the Internet. And really, the world has not been the same, right? No, it has not been the same, and it's not going to ever be the same after that date, August 6th, 1991. First day, a worldwide network of computers was linked together. The accumulated knowledge of mankind was now available to anyone who could get on a computer and look it up. And what do you think, what search subject was the number one top rated search subject that went right to the top within a few weeks and months? Sex. Yeah. Does that surprise anybody? No. It tells us about mankind. It tells us mankind has a deep hunger and fascination with sex. And you say, Pastor, we're in church today. What are we talking about this for? We have to talk about this, as we've said in the past. The world is talking about it, right? The world is singing about it. The world is writing novels and magazines and movies and all sorts of anything on the Internet. It's everywhere out there, and we cannot hide our heads in the sand and just ignore this. The world is filled with Satan's message about sex. Just about every time sex is presented in our societies, it is usually the wrong message. It is not what God intended. And that's why it's so important that we have Jesus' view and understanding of sex correctly presented in our churches and throughout society to save the world from the direction that it's been heading for so long. So this morning we're going to be looking at 3 ways from God for defeating sexual temptation. 3 ways from God on defeating sexual temptation. Is this something we need to hear? Absolutely we need to hear this. And God gives it here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And we're not the only ones who needed to hear it. Way back in Paul's day, they needed to hear it, and we're asking questions about it. Let's begin. 3 ways of defeating sexual temptation from God. Verse 1, 1 Corinthians 7, verse 1 says this. Now concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. All right, let's look first at those opening words. It says, now concerning the things about which you wrote. This tells us that the Corinthians had written a letter to Paul ahead of this time, and it apparently had a list of questions. What about this? What about that? What about this? What about that? And in the next couple of chapters, he addresses a number one of all of those questions. He just goes through and answers them. But in this chapter, he begins with the first question. Now, Paul was there, and he opened it up, and he saw their first question, and the first question was, is it good for a man not to touch a woman? Is that okay? Now, what in the world are they talking about? How would you answer that if someone comes up to you and says, hey, is it okay for a man not to touch a woman? What would you say? It helps to understand what they mean by the word touch. Proverbs says in Proverbs 6:29, whoever touches his neighbor's wife will not go unpunished. Proverbs 6:29, whoever touches his neighbor's wife will not go unpunished. That means you walk up to your neighbor's wife and say, how do you do? And you shake her hand. Sorry, you're going to get punished. No, that's not what it's talking about. It's talking about a sexual touch. Whoever has sexual relationship with his neighbor's wife will not go unpunished. And it's in that sense that they were asking this question. Is it okay for a man not to touch, not to have sexual relations with a woman? And you're saying, well, why would you even ask that? Because it was their way of asking, is it okay to be single? To not get married and have a sexual relationship with your wife? That's what they were asking. Is it okay to stay single? That was on their list of things. Now, why would they ask if it's okay to stay single? Well, apparently back then, they had the same problems going on that we have in our society today too. In many churches today, if a person reaches a certain age, say like 30 years old, and they're not married, people will say, what's wrong? Why aren't you married? Come on, we got to hook you up with a guy. We got to hook you up with a woman so you two can get married and have kids and have a family, because it's not okay to be single. That goes on today, and it apparently was going on back then. And that's what the Corinthians were asking. Is it okay? And we have people in our church who are staying single. Is it okay for a man to stay single and not get married? And what was Paul's answer? Paul says in verse 1, he says, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. It's good for a man to stay single and not get married. God, through Paul, said it's not just okay. God, through Paul, says it's actually good. It's actually a good thing for a person to stay single. Look at verses 7 and 8. Paul says, yet I wish that all men were even as I am myself, single. However, each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner, another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I. Paul is saying here, look, if I had it my way, every Christian would be single. And single people in the congregation remain single. That's what Paul was saying. And verse 32, he tells why. Jump down to verse 32. This is his reasoning. He says, I want you to be free from concern. One who is unmarried is concerned about the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how he may please his wife, and his interests are divided. The woman who is unmarried and the virgin is concerned about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy, both in body and spirit. But one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. This I say for your own benefit, not to put a restraint upon you, but to promote what is appropriate and to secure, here it is, undistracted devotion to the Lord. That was Paul's goal. So Paul is saying there's two states that adults can be in, that is married or single. And he says both are good. Being single isn't like a lower level, second class state of being an adult. Have we forgotten that Jesus was a single? Being married and being single are both very good. In fact, Paul says, if you have, though, the choice to be either single or married, consider singleness first. If you have the choice, consider singleness first. And why? He says in these verses here, because it's easier to be devoted to the Lord if you're single. It's easier to be devoted to the Lord if you're single. God commands us to love Him with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, both singles and marrieds. We're all responsible to do that. God is number one, our number one devotion. But Paul says it's going to be harder for marrieds to do that. It's going to be harder because of the necessity of focusing upon your spouse and your children. You're going to have to do that, but you still have to remain absolutely 100% most devoted to God. Being married, it's going to be harder to do that. God commands us to set our minds on the things above, as Carlene was talking about, not on things on the earth. It's going to be harder for married people to obey that command. Still have to do it, but it's going to be harder because married people of necessity have to focus on the things of the world more because of their spouse and their family. Don't misunderstand. God is not saying marriage is not good. Marriage is good. Marriage is a picture of Jesus and the church's relationship to Him. It is good, and it's what God intends, apparently through history, for most people. But what Paul is saying here is, it's harder. It's harder to remain completely devoted to God because of the extra responsibilities that come with being married. And that's why Paul says, if you have the choice, consider singleness first. Consider singleness first. And yet, he knew that that was not going to happen with everybody. It was his wish that everybody could be single, but he knew it couldn't happen with everybody because, as it says in verse 7, each man has his own gift from God. Being able to be single is something that God touches you with and gives you an ability to be single in a world where most people are married. How do you know if you have the gift of being married or being single? Paul shows one way in verses 8 and 9. Look at verse 8. He says, we saw this, I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I. Look at verse 9. But if they do not have self-control, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Up to this point, Paul has not used the word better. He said it's good to be married and it's good to be single. Both of them are equal. Don't say one is lower or higher than the other. Both are good. One is not better than the other. But at this point, he goes, unless a certain circumstance happens, then it is better to be married. What is it? If you're burning with sexual desire, then it is better to be a married person rather than to remain a single person. How do you know if you have the gift of being a single person? You're probably not going to burn with sexual desire. Doesn't mean it won't be an issue in your life, but you're not going to be able to not control it. And this is where Paul gives the first way in which God says how to defeat sexual temptation. Look at verses 1 and 2 again. Verse 1, now concerning the things about which I wrote, is it good for a man not to touch, not to marry? Verse 2, he says, it is good, but verse 2, but because of sexual sin, because of sex sin, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. There's God's instruction. We talked about before about how bad the temptations were in Corinth, about how the city was filled with people who were looking, sailors, trades, people from all over the world, officials coming in, doing business, constantly looking for sexual activity, and available and be able to find it. Just about every tavern or inn, the temple there had 1,000 temple prostitutes. It is bad in our day. It was really bad in the Corinthians' day. And how did Paul say, what is the answer to being able to be sexually pure? God's answer was to find a person to marry and have sex with them. That's what God says. That's his answer. How is a single man supposed to control his sexual desire in a city like that? Find a woman and marry her. How is a married man supposed to control himself in a city that is advertising sex everywhere? How is a married woman supposed to control her sexual desire in an environment like that? Go home and practice marital sex with each other. That's what God's answer is. God's first way of defeating sexual desire, what this passage is very clear on, is meet your sexual needs in marriage. Meet your sexual needs in marriage. Number one, meet your sexual needs in marriage. Of course, our society forcefully rejects this. Absolutely no way. Why would you have to get married to meet your sexual needs? There are so many available places where you can go and find other people. And even if you don't find someone else, you can fulfill your lusts just about everywhere you look and read and watch. There's no need to be married in order to meet your sexual needs. God says, yeah, there is. God says, who needs marriage? You do. Because while expressing meeting your sexual needs outside of marriage can be very thrilling, where does that road lead? Where does that road lead if you decide to take that? God says that road leads to ruining your life. And no, you don't see that as you read the novel, as you look at the magazine, as you watch the television show or the movie. You don't see these people experiencing destruction most of the time. But they're on that road. Satan doesn't want you to see where that road ends. But the Bible is very clear about it. Hebrews 13:4 says, let the marriage bed be kept pure. Let the marriage bed be kept pure. For those who commit sexual sin and adultery, God will judge and punish. That's where the road leads. And people for years don't meet the end of that road sometimes. And they think, this is no big deal. Everybody's doing it. Everybody's enjoying it. God says, you go down that road, I'll tell you where it ends. It ends in judgment and punishment. He who touches his neighbor's wife will not go unpunished, God says. That's the end of that road. We've looked at 1 Corinthians 6:18 before. It says, flee sexual immorality. Flee sex sin. What does that word flee mean, by the way? It doesn't just mean to run away from something. It means to run away from a danger. That's what that word flee means. You run away from someone playing a game of hide and go seek or tag. That's running away. But fleeing is you're running from a mugger who's dangerous. You're running from a bear who's dangerous. You're running from a tornado that's dangerous. And God says, flee from the danger of sex sin outside of marriage. Flee from it because it is a danger that is trying to overtake you and will ruin your life. Flee from that danger, God warns us. So in a world filled with sexual temptation, God gives us a very, very, very practical way to defeat it. Number one, if you're single and you're burning with sexual desire, God says, go get married and have sex with your spouse. That's what God says. And He says, if you're married and struggling with sexual desire, go get with your wife and have marital sex. That's what God says. It couldn't be more practical. Look at verses 3 and 4. Verses 3 and 4. The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise also the husband does not have authority over his body, but the wife does. And here God gives the second way to defeat sexual temptation. The first way is to meet your sexual needs within your marriage. But also the second one is obey God's command to meet your spouse's sexual needs in marriage. So meet your needs in marriage, but also help meet your spouse's needs in marriage. You know the symbol of the rainbow? God's beautiful symbol of the rainbow about His promise of love and taking care of the world? And how that's been ripped away from its Bible meaning, and now it's used to support what God forbids, homosexuality. In the same way, sex has been ripped out of God's intention for it and used to promote what God forbids, what is unholy, what is filthy, what is perverted. But it's time that, just like the symbol of the rainbow, that sex be pulled back into the beautiful, marital, joyful thing that God wanted it to be, and not allow the world to define what's right sex is. God has told us what right sex is, and we as Christians need to hold that up again. God created sex, and God mandated that Adam and Eve engage in it and populate the earth. When God was giving the law to Moses, He required in there that every new husband is supposed to have a year taken off from his public responsibilities so that he may, and it says, quote, that he may stay home and bring happiness to his wife. Proverbs 5:15 says, may you rejoice in the wife of your youth, a loving doe, a graceful deer, may you ever be captivated by her love. And of course the Song of Solomon is filled with the joy and beauty of married sexuality. God wants us understanding that His version of sex is beautiful, is joyful, is holy. And that's what we need to lift up in our society. Not allow the world to capture it and redefine it into something that's unholy and that leads to ruin. God says married sex is beautiful and holy. And He wants us understanding that spouses have the responsibility to promote that beauty and holiness in the lives of their marriage partner. So that when your marriage partner is tempted by the many temptations that are around us here in this world, you understand your job is to help them remain holy in an unholy world. And that you take God's command seriously, to obey His command to meet the needs of your spouse sexually. And that leads us to the third way that God talks about defeating sexual temptation. Number one, meet your sexual needs in marriage. Number two, meet your spouse's needs in marriage. But number three, only abstain from marital sex with agreement from your spouse. Only abstain from marital sex with agreement from your spouse. Look at verse 5. It says, stop depriving one another. Apparently they were. Stop depriving one another, except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer, and come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Here God commands husbands and wives to have regular sexual activity with each other. If you're single, you're probably scratching your head thinking, why would you have to tell married people to have regular sexual activity? If I were married, I'd be having sex every day. Well, once you get married, you realize that a lot of things complicate life. It gets busy, it gets stressful, you have kids, you get tired, you have relationship squabbles, and a lot of things come along to disrupt the marital harmony in the bedroom. But God says you must overcome these difficulties. You cannot set this aside. You live in a world where Satan is waiting and actively looking for sexually frustrated married couples, sexually starving married couples, sexually needy. And he'll be right there to lead them down a path of temptation that will ruin their relationship with God and harm their relationship with their spouse, and go on and on and on. You and I have all seen how marriages and families have been destroyed because of unfaithfulness. God says, do whatever it takes to work out these problems. Married couples, your spouse lives in a world of strong sexual temptation, and God has handed them a way to be holy within it. It's you. It's you. So wives, when your husbands are out there and they are faced with powerful sexual temptations, God says, you make sure your husband is being taken care of and is sexually satisfied. That's an order from God. Husbands, same thing for your wives as they experience strong sexual temptation. You go and make sure that they are sexually satisfied. And you only abstain when you agree. And in this case it says, for a special time of seeking God. Remember, it's very, very important to keep God as the number one devotion in our life, whether we're married or single. And there might be times that you need to especially seek God in prayer or time with God, where you spend special time with Him. God says you can do that, but number one, only with the agreement of your spouse. If your spouse says this is not a good time, then you don't do it. If your spouse says, okay, this is a good time, then you have permission. But then, even then, temporarily, God says. Only then, after a bit, the Bible says, come back together again, because Satan is right there looking for someone who's sexually unsatisfied, to draw them away and to pull them into the active sexual activity, or at least into lustful sexual activity, which God says is as bad as active sexual activity. So God does not fool around with this subject. And yes, this is a very straightforward sermon, but I'm not saying anything more than what God is saying, and if He said it, He wants us all to hear it. As the internet shows, people are fascinated by sexual activity and are seeking to be fulfilled by it. But God says you cannot do that just any old way. There's only one way to have an enriched, fulfilled sexual life, and that's within marriage. Marriage alone. The beautiful and holy experience of married sex is a wonderful thing, God says. You are never going to find that ever outside of marriage, God says. So make sure that you are not abstaining from it within marriage, God says. Spouses, take care of each other and take this seriously. So here are 3 questions that we need to end up with. Number 1, if you're married, is your first devotion to God? There are so many things to distract us in marriage from God being the number one passion and devotion of our lives. There must be no competition, absolutely, hands down, no question. I am most devoted to God. Jesus said, he who loves father or mother more than me, wife or husband more than me, son or daughter more than me, is not worthy of me. Jesus says, you cannot have me in second, third, fourth, whatever place. I must be, whether you're married or single, first place in your devotion, in your life. Single people, are you taking the advantage of your greater freedom to be highly devoted to God? Do that. And married people, are you making sure that you're not allowing the necessary focus on this world and your spouse and your family to diminish your devotion to God. Make sure that He is your number one devotion in life. Then number two, are you attempting to meet your sexual needs outside of marriage, whether single or married? Are you attempting to meet your sexual needs outside of marriage? You know, you can go into a bank and withdraw money and use that money to go enjoy yourself. Or you can go to that same bank and invest money and make yourself wealthier. Unmarried sex is like going to that bank and withdrawing money. As you go with unmarried sex, you're withdrawing life from yourself. You're not making your life richer, you're making yourself poorer. Marital sex has the ability to invest and enrich your life, God says, to make your life stronger, to make your life better, because it's a beautiful and holy thing when it's in the context of marriage. Are you seeking to meet your needs outside of marriage? Whether it be actively with another person, God says you must forbid and stay away from that and never go back to that. Or passively through lust and engaging in so many of the opportunities for the lust of the flesh that are around us. Do you need to turn away from that and deny that? God says flee the danger of sexual immorality, sex sin. Do you need to do that today? And number three, do you need to obey God's command to meet your spouse's sexual needs? Have you been denying your spouse? Have you been neglecting your spouse? Have you been using sex as a weapon and withdrawing it from your spouse? That happens way too much. God says, be serious about obeying Him, because you sin when you don't take care of your spouse's sexual needs. You sin. Abstaining without their permission is sin. Stop sinning, God says. And make sure you're taking care of your spouse. You are a key to their being holy in an unholy world. Don't be guilty of causing them to be tempted to fall away. Let me close with a quote that I found from a Christian woman named Joy McMillan. She said, "Sexual energy is just that. It's energy. And where we choose to spend that energy makes all the difference in the world." The world's way of spending that energy is just any way you want. It doesn't matter. God says flee from that danger, because it leads to judgment and punishment. God's way is spend that energy in the beauty and holiness of marriage. That will enrich your life. That will make you healthier and invest in your life the way that God intended it to be. Where we choose to spend that energy makes all the difference in the world, and it really does. Let's make sure we're all committing ourselves to holiness in this area of that spending, that sexual energy.